We're very glad to bring to you two women who are each important forces in Quebecois and Canadian culture, author Martine Delvaux and Sylvie Lacerte, guest curator of the exhibition Riopelle, Crossroads in Time. Je tiens à reconnaître que le Musée des Beaux-Arts du Canada est situé sur le territoire traditionnel et non cédé de la nation algonquine
traditional
Anishinaabe.
and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people. We are grateful to be able to settle on these lands and express our gratitude to the custodians of these lands who remind us of its importance, its history, and its significance. In a few moments, I will invite Sylvie Lacerte to take the floor. Sylvie will introduce Martine Delvaux, and both will then sit down for a conversation. We'll save a few minutes at the end to take questions from the public. All of this evening is presented via Zoom so that the virtual public can be able to hear the questions in the room, and I'll invite everyone to use a microphone for those present in the room. Those attending from Zoom, you can equally ask questions. You only have to submit them through the Q&A window on Zoom, and we will read them out here in the room. Right now, I have the singular honor and privilege to introduce Sylvie Lacerte. She's a historian and theoretician of art. Her fields of interest cut across contemporary art, both in terms of technology and digitalization. Her activities as curator, speaker, and artist have led her to share her knowledge in Quebec, where she teaches in different universities, University Le Cam, McGill, and Laval, and elsewhere in Canada, in Europe, and in Asia. In addition to her work, Mediation on Contemporary Art in 2017, she has signed several essays in exhibition catalogs, anthologies, art reviews. Lacerte has equally organized multiple exhibitions as independent curator, but also under the aegis of the Musée des Beaux-Arts of Montreal, where she produced Survivance by Manuel Mathieu in 2020, Caroline Monet in 2021, as she was the curator of contemporary art. And she has worked on several other multiple projects besides Riopelle, Crossroads in Time. She has organized meeting points in Fredericksburg and elliptic landscapes, François Vincent Sutton, and she equally worked on a monograph dedicated to Antonia de Grassi, the publication house Sagami. So thank you very much. I'd like to invite Sylvie Lacerte to come up and take the floor. Good evening. It is going to be quite an intimate evening. Thank you for being there. Thank you, David, for the introduction. And I have the pleasure of introducing Martine Delvaux, who's a writer, an essayist, a feminist essayist, and a professor of literature. Martine is the author of Thelma, Martine et Moi, Nan Golden, Lambert, and finalist of the literary prizes of the Governor General, Le Monde est à toi, Pompière et Pyromane, and finalist of the Victor Barbeau Prize and Les Filles en Série, the Barbie au Pussy Riot, and her work, The Boys Club, won the Grand Book Prize in Montreal. She recently produced a literary essay with Jennifer Bélanger, and her very well-acclaimed work, which could have been a great movie, which earned her several prizes. Most of her works are translated in English and Spanish. So, Martine, please come sit down with me. So here's the book. Good evening, and thank you for being here. So I will start by making a parallel between our two backgrounds, because Martine and myself discovered Riopelle, Jean Mitchell, and another author for you almost at the same time. This started with you 3 years ago, and same for me. And back then,
comment dire, externe
I
au à
was
l'univers de
a stranger to
Riopelle,
the universe of
parce que le
Riopelle
musée
because
souhaitait avoir
the
quelqu'un, qui avait
gallery
un regard
needed
frais
someone
sur
who had a
Riopelle
fresh perspective on
et
Riopelle, and
Martine
Martine
est
um,
entrée, presque
entered
par hasard
almost,
dans ce travail de recherche
coincidentally in
d'entreprise,
her research and
sur,
investigative role on
Riopelle, John
Riopelle,
Mitchell et
Jean
Hollis
Michel
Delvaux.
and Hollis.
Alors,
And so
je te laisse la
I'll
parole.
turn it over to
Sylvie,
you then.
c'était très touchant
And
quand
it's very
quand
touching
tu es
when the book
sortie.
was published.
Sylvie a fait un
Sylvie
commentaire
made
sur
a comment
Facebook
on
et on a
Facebook,
compris qu'elle,
and
en fait,
we
à la fin,
understood
tu faisais
at the
la
end
même
that you were
installation de lecture que
preparing,
ses sœurs.
setting
Et
up
c'est
the
drôle. Et
exhibition
cette
and reading
rencontre-là,
my
en
book
fait,
at the
a
same time.
saison un cadeau. On
So
s'est rencontrés
we
pendant une entremise
met
de l'expo
as a result of the
et
exhibition
souvent,
and the
en arrivant de
launching of the book.
l'extérieur
So
de la bulle de
we
protection de
met
l'autre.
outside the
Et dans
bubble
mon
of
cas,
Riopelle.
c'est ce que je
And what
raconte
I
dans le livre, c'est le point de départ
tell
du
as
livre, c'est
what I
cette
recount in the story
rencontre
is
que
the
j'ai
starting
eue
point
il y a
of
peu de temps avec
the
un
meeting I had
producteur
4 years
de film
ago with
qui m'a
filmmaker
laissé un message
who left
d'envoi
me a
pour nous
message and
rencontrer
wanted to
et il
meet
voulait
with
que
me
j'écrive
and wanted
un
me to
scénario
prepare
pour
a
le
script
projet qu'il avait
for a
mis à tête de
project
sa
which was
carte.
very important to
C'était
him.
un
It
scénario pour
was a
raconter trois
movie
frères sur la relation
script between
passionnelle
a
orageuse
passionate,
entre
a passionate and
Jean Paul Riopelle et
rocky
Joan
relationship
Mitchell. Et quand il me
between
l'a
Jean-Michel
proposé,
and
j'ai
a
vraiment
woman. And
complètement
when he
envie de
approached me, I
travailler
really
là-dessus.
didn't want to work
Et
on
c'est
it,
comme s'il
but
l'avait
it
senti
seemed
en
like he
moi
had
et il a dit,
understood.
mais il y
He
avait
had
une
felt
troisième
it in me, and
personne
there
dans
was a
cette
third
affaire-là.
person
Il
in
y
that
avait une
story. There
jeune
was a
femme
young lady,
et elle
and
était
she was the
l'assistante,
assistant,
compagne,
the
amie de
companion and
Mitchell,
friend
mais elle a
of
fini par
Mitchell, but
partir avec
finally ended
Riopelle.
up with Real
Et j'ai
Pell.
dit,
So I
OK,
said,
ça
well,
m'intéresse.
now
Cette
this
femme-là,
gets
ça
interesting.
m'intéresse. Et
This
puis j'ai dit,
woman
trio,
seems
une histoire
interesting
qui
to
était
me. So
moins,
this was a love triangle,
moins
which was less
lisse, on pourrait dire,
conventional, so to
que
speak.
enfin, tu avais l'impression qu'il y
That
avait
was my first
des
impression. And
rencontres
when
dans
I
la maison
got
qui
back
sont
home, I started
s'attacher. Et c'est là que je
researching,
suis
and
tombée
very
sur
quickly I
Hollis
stumbled on
Jeffcoat, qui
Hollis
est donc le
Jeffcoat, who's the
peintre qui a
painter
réalisé
who
un de
worked
ses
on one of
tableaux, qui
these
a été le tableau de
paintings. It
prédiction
was
tout au long
very
de sa vie.
productive all through her
C'est le
life.
tableau de la
And this is
période
a
justement des
painting
fauteuils, donc la période où elle
uh,
était avec
during the time when she was
Riopelle.
with
Oui,
Riopelle and
c'est
Mitchell.
ça. Et tu vas nous
So you're
lire
going to
ouais,
read
c'est
an
ça.
excerpt?
J'essaie de
Well,
trouver un
yes, I tried
extrait.
to
Donc, c'est
find
un
one, and
livre
this is a
qui
book
est.
that is, how can I say this?
J'écris des
I
livres qui sont un peu
wrote
vis-à-vis.
books that are like
C'est un
updates,
livre qui
and
raconte
these are books that
mon
recount
enquête,
my story
je vous
and
invite à me suivre dans
invite
cette
you to
enquête, mais c'est aussi un
walk
livre
with
qui
me
parle de
through
l'histoire de
this
l'art, qui parle de la
investigation,
place
talks
des
about the
femmes
history of
dans
art, the
l'histoire
place
de
of
l'art,
women in
et qui parle
art,
évidemment
and also
de
talks
ces
about these
personnages-là que sont
personalities
Jean-Paul,
who are
Joan
Jean-Paul,
et
Joan, and
Hollis,
Hollis,
que je nomme
whom
par leur prénom.
I would cite
Et
by
on
their
va
first
lire un
names, and
extrait qui
I'll
donne un
read
peu
an
une idée de
extract
ce que
that
c'est
gives you
que
an
le
idea
livre
of what this book
et
is
tout
all
son
about. I'll do all of
environnement.
that at the same time.
1981,
1981.
c'est l'été.
It's summertime.
Jean-Paul et
Jean
toi,
Paul
vous
and you
rendez
are
la
visiting the
Fondation
MAC
MAG et sa
Foundation
maison
and
des
its Maison
artistes à
des Artistes in
Saint-Paul-de-Vence.
Saint-Paul-de-Valence.
Dans l'œil des
In the
documentaristes
documentaries by
Pierre
Pierre
Le
Letaft
Taft et
and
Marianne
Marianne
Fever,
Fever, we
on
see
vous
you
voit
side by
côte à
side as
côte.
Jean Paul
Pendant que
works on
Jean-Paul travaille
terracotta
des plaques de
plaques
tapisserie en
for a
plafond
porcelain
en
ceiling meant
porcelaine
for
pour
a
un
town
hôtel de
hall.
ville.
It
On
looks
dirait
like a cloud.
l'élaboration d'un nuage.
Jean Paul and
Là-dessus, ils
Hans
travaillent
are working
conjoints entre
together on the
Jean-Paul et
composition
Hans
of this
sur la
ceiling.
manière de composer ce plafond, les plaques liées les unes aux autres par un joint
The
transparent.
plaques are linked
Le
together
joint,
by
c'est
a
l'écriture
transparent
de
joint.
l'œuvre. Pierre
Pierre
Le
Letaft
Taft
asked the
demande au
painter if
peintre
he
si ça
minds the
t'emmerde,
blank
la page
page.
blanche, la toile blanche.
Jean
Jean-Paul
Paul
répond que
said
non,
no,
qu'il ne se donne pas de limite
he
de temps,
doesn't
refuse
really
les
have any
dates. Si ça
deadlines.
marche
He
tant mieux, si
refuses
ça marche pas, tant pis
deadlines,
pour
and
moi.
that if it
Le
works,
travail avec
great.
les
If
plaques de terre
not,
cuite est
too
lié à
bad for
celui
me.
des
The
jeux de
work with the
ficelle.
terracotta plaques is linked
Jean-Paul
to
pose une
Riopelle's
corde
work
entre les
titled
plaques en
Jeu de
guise de joint.
ficelle. Jean
Reprenant
Paul
les
lays a
gestes
string
qu'il
between the
explique à
plaques,
Madeleine
which he
Arbour
uses
dans le
as a
reportage
joint.
qu'elle fait sur
In
lui.
doing so, he
Moi,
repeats
tout
the
est
gestures he
difficile en
explained to
faisant et en
Madeleine
défaisant
Arbour
les
in her
plaques.
article on him. In
En 2021,
2021, at the
au musée
Montreal
des Beaux-Arts
Museum
de
of Fine
Montréal, je
Arts, I
traverse
walked through the
l'exposition
Riopelle
Riopelle
exhibition.
à la rencontre des territoires nordiques et des
When
cultures
I
autochtones.
arrived at the section on Northern
Je te
and
cherche, tu es
Indigenous
là aussi.
cultures, I was looking for
Je
you
voudrais
there.
savoir où tu
I was looking
t'inscris
for you there.
par-delà
Beyond
ta
your
pratique
hunting
de
and
la chasse et
fishing,
de
I
la
wondered
pêche,
where you
dans
fit
cette
in as I
fréquentation
viewed
des
all of
milieux
these cultural
autochtones.
articles. So, would you be
Est-ce que ça
interested in
t'intéressait?
this? Is there
Est-ce qu'il y a
a
une
as a
partie de
South
toi qui est
American
du
that you
sud
can
qui te
relate to?
retrouvait?
That the
Est-ce
two
que
of
vous
you
en
talk about
discutiez
this?
tous les deux?
Did you talk
Parliez-vous de
about
cette série d'œuvres
This series of works inspired by Jean Paul's travels in the north, Jeux de ficelles, Roi de Tulé, icebergs. The exhibition presented native objects and works out of their context and the people who created them, cut off from their spirits and the voices that could tell us about them. These objects are as good as dead, said Guy Suy Durand. How can we understand a relationship with living nature if not through abstraction, he asked. Not to imitate, reproduce, represent, but rather to get closer, to catch. Yet, as Florence Lavoie pointed out, it was largely outside Indigenous communities that Jean Paul discovered their creative potential, just as he drew inspiration from the Surrealists' collections of primitive art. Nothing is simple.
Et
The
le
painter
peintre
is
fait partie de sa
part of a
génération.
generation.
Il arrive
Painters
avant les prises de
existed
conscience, avant les
before the
remises en question des
awareness and
pratiques
questioning of
muséales
Western museum
occidentales.
practices.
Je me dis que
I
toi,
think
Martine, si
myself
au
that you
moment
are
où
so
Sylvie
young,
avait 18
parachuted
ans,
into a world that
parachutée
you
dans ce
can't even begin
univers
to
dans une mesure sans
understand. You
doute folle
can't
de
understand your
privilège, tu
privilege.
n'es pas au fait
You're
de
not
ce qui se
aware
fait
of what's going
dans les
on there in the
voyages, les
travels, the
ateliers, les
studio, the
musées,
museum,
qui
and
concernent
what all
la
things
colonialité.
and all things rather related to
Dans le kiosque
colonialism.
installé à la
In
sortie
the
de
kiosk that
l'exposition,
was
je
set up at
feuillette le
the
catalogue raisonné,
exhibition's
en
exit,
espérant
I
y
leaf through
trouver
the
une
descriptive
reproduction
catalog,
du
hoping to
portrait que
find a
Jean Paul
reproduction
a
of Jean
fait
Paul's
de toi.
portrait of you. The
Les
volumes
volumes
are
sont
heavy.
lourds, j'ai
I
du mal
have
à
a
les
hard time
manipuler.
handling them. I
Tourne les
turned
pages
the
plusieurs
pages
fois,
several
vers la
times
fin,
toward the end
puis à
of the
rebours.
catalog and then
Rien à
front to
faire.
back
Je
and
ne
back
le
to
trouve
front.
pas. Avec tes
In
cheveux
Hélène de
bouclés, ton
Billy's
t-shirt
eyes,
et ton
with your
jean,
curly
dans
hair
le
and
regard d'Hélène
jeans
de
and
Billy,
t-shirt,
on dirait qu'il sort tout
you
droit
look
de la
like you're straight out of
contre-culture
an American
américaine.
counterculture. You're
Aérienne,
airy,
filiforme,
wiry, with an
visage
androgynous
androgyne sous ta
face
couronne
beneath
de
your
cheveux
crown of curly
bouclés,
hair.
assise sur
Sitting
un
on a
divan à
couch
l'intérieur,
inside,
tes yeux
your eyes light
s'illuminent
up
quand
when
il
he
apparaît
appears
devant
before
toi,
you,
avec à la
holding a
main un
bouquet of
bouquet de
flowers
fleurs
picked from
cueillies
the
dans le jardin,
garden.
des
There were
nénuphars
water
pris
lilies
dans
from
les
the
pans,
pond.
et qu'il
He
arrose
arranged
dans un
them in a
vase.
vase for
Pourquoi?
you and
En racontant
told you
l'histoire de
the
sa
story
tante aux
about his
400
aunt's
chapeaux
400
violets
purple hats
accumulés
she
pendant la
accumulated
guerre au
during the war
Gabon
for
manqué
fear
de
of running
bouffe.
out.
Il entre
He
dans la
entered in the
maison en
house
disant
saying, "Hello,
bonjour
madam.
madame, je viens
I've
vous
come to give you some
offrir des
flowers."
fleurs.
You burst out
Ton rire
laughing
éclate,
and you turn
disparaît et
back
tu
to the
recules le
newspaper
journal
that
que
you
tu
were
lisais.
reading. Further on in
Plus
the
loin dans le
film,
film,
we
on te
can
voit
see you
debout
standing
devant
in
un lit
front
de
of
l'autre
him
côté
on
du
the other
souper
side of a
sur
glass
laquelle sont
panel on which
installées
there are
des plaques de porcelaine.
porcelain plates.
Tu commences,
You
tu fais
comment, you
des
make
suggestions.
suggestions.
Tu es
You're very
parfaitement
confident.
sûr de toi.
You don't look like the
Tu n'aimes pas
you
la
don't
façon
like
dont
the
la
way
corde est
the rope has
installée
been
sur les
installed
plaques.
under the
Et
plates.
devant les
Faced with
illustrations de
Jean Paul's
Jean-Paul, tu dis
hesitations, you
légèrement
say with a
ironique,
little
pourquoi pas faire un
irony,
dessin
why not
avec la
draw a
corde?
picture with the
Un
rope?
dessin,
A
tu sais,
drawing,
à
a
Riopelle.
Riopelle. Jean Paul
Jean-Paul
listens
t'écoute
to
et il
you
obéit. Il fait comme
and
tu
actually
dis.
does as you
La scène
suggested.
suivante vous montre
In the
un homme
next
déboîtant
scene,
une
we see
collection
you
de
in one of Jean
Jean-Paul. Il
Paul's
est au
classic
volant,
cars
sourit à la
behind the wheel,
caméra, fait un
smiling at the
clin d'œil.
camera,
Puis
winking.
retour à la
Then
Fondation
it's back
Mag
to the
où vous
Mag
discutez du
Foundation,
droit ou
where you
non
can
des
discuss,
propriétaires
amongst other
d'œuvres
things, the right of
artistiques de les
artwork
revendre en
owners to
pièces de
resell them in
papier.
separate pieces.
À qui
Who
appartient
owns these
l'œuvre?
works? The only
Le seul
pleasure
plaisir qu'ont
painters
les
have is to
peintres, c'est de
produce a
faire le
painting,
tableau,
says Jean
dit
Paul.
Jean-Paul.
So, in the
Ici, dans
Saint-Cyr
l'atelier Saint-Cyr,
studio,
quand Gisèle
when collector
Michelin,
Gisèle
collectionneuse, vient
Michelin
faire signer ses
came to sign
toiles,
her
il
paintings,
demande:
he
Tu veux que je
asked,
signe
"What do you
quoi?
want me to sign?
Chagall?
Chagall?
Giacometti?
Gia-
La
Giacometti?"
dernière
The
scène du
film's
film nous
penultimate
montre tous
scene
les deux
shows the
avec
two of
Tomac,
you
le
with Tomac,
shérif,
the
au bord
dog,
de
by the
l'eau, à
water
l'île aux
at
grues,
L'Île
puis avec
Grue,
Jean-Louis
and then
Murat
with
de la
Jean-Louis
Fondation Mag.
Murat from the
Je me
Meg
dis que c'est toi
Foundation.
que
I say to
Jean-Paul
myself,
regarde quand il est
Jean
tourné vers
Paul
la
is
caméra,
one,
avec
Jean
cette
Paul is
lumière dans
looking at
les
you
yeux,
when he's looking at the
curiosité,
camera. He has
amusement,
that light in
attiré
his
par un
eyes,
autre
his
visage comme par
curiosity, and he has a
alignement.
certain amusement.
Devant une photo
His
de
face is
Jean-Paul, tu dis
attracted
à
to
Hélène
another
qu'il est
as
magnifique.
by a magnet. In front of a photo of Jean Paul,
Merci.
you say to Hélène
Très bel extrait.
that he's magnificent.
Alors, j'ai découvert le livre de Martine alors que
So I
nous
discovered
étions en plein
Martin's
montage pour
book while we were
l'exposition
preparing
Riopelle.
the Riopelle
Le livre venait de
exhibition. The book had
paraître
just
et
been published,
j'en
and I
revenais
couldn't
pas
believe
parce
it
que je
because
me
I
disais,
was
mon
like,
Dieu,
oh my God,
deux
two
étrangères de
strangers
Riopelle
to
qui suivent
Riopelle
ce
who
même
are on the
parcours.
same course
Et
following
ça
his
m'a vraiment
background, and I
fasciné.
was
Je me suis
fascinated.
dit,
So I
faut
was like,
qu'on se
well, we
rencontre.
need to meet.
Et tantôt,
And
on a fait
then
une visite
we
de
visited an
l'exposition.
Oui,
On
exhibition,
s'est
and
remis
this was
d'autres
another
étapes
step
aussi dans
in
c'est ça.
our meeting or coming
Alors,
together. So
Hollis, et en fait,
Alice,
je suis
and
presque
I'm almost
gênée de dire qu'il n'y a pas de Hollis
uncomfortable
Jeffcoat
to
dans
say that there's no
l'exposition,
work
parce
from
que,
Holly
évidemment,
Jesco
je ne
in
m'étais
the
pas rendue
exhibition. I've not
jusque-là. Il
gotten
y
to
a une
that
œuvre
point yet. There's
de
a
Joan
work from
Mitchell, mais pas de
Joan Mitchell,
Hollis.
but not from Hollis.
Alors,
And
c'est
this
une
is an
artiste que tu
artist
as
whom you
découverte à
discovered
travers ce
through this
producteur, et c'est
movie
devenu
producer,
vraiment une
and
obsession, je dirais.
became quite an
Ouais.
obsession.
En fait, je
Well,
suis
I'm
obsédée par
obsessed
la
by the
disparition des femmes de manière générale.
Mhm.
disappearance of
C'est sûr
women
que
in
si on nous
general.
présente
Of course, if you
une
present a
histoire
story
que celle
in
d'une
which there's a
femme là-dedans
woman
qui est un peu effacée,
who
ça
fades
attire
into
mon
the woodwork,
attention.
Oui.
that draws my
Et j'ai
attention.
été happée
And I
par ça,
was
c'est-à-dire
struck by that. And I realized by searching, I knew nothing about Mitchell, really nothing about, I mean, not as, not, I mean, barely as much as the common lead person on the street. So I went through biographies, I went through the catalogs that the movie maker had brought me, and went on internet. And I realized that every time she was always reduced to a footnote in a, so I decided to take her out of that footnote and make her key character, major character in the book. And then sometimes I have a small detective side, so I would move from investigation to investigation, from piece to piece, and try to uncover who this woman was. And she died a few months earlier from cancer. She was 65 years old, and I tried to backtrack. I went back in time. I checked where she used to live. I met with her widower. I wrote a biography without really doing it as an investigator. I didn't have any crimes to investigate, besides the fact of finding out who she was. But of course, you needed to have a few hints and tips in order to be able to tell the story. And through this quest of yours, you recount that you fell in love with all three protagonists, and I find this really striking. Well, yes, I got into the story as saying, well, yes, she's my center of attention and she is going to be my sole focus. But eventually, placing my eyes on her is indirectly equally focusing on Riopelle and Mitchell. And for 4 years, I walked through their lives, moving from one person's life to the other. And each time, I would realize that I had to add this to the book and I had to resist the temptation because getting into the life of Jean Paul Riopelle is like walking into a dark hole or a rabbit hole into which you get and you're completely absorbed. The same as Mitchell, these are unbelievable lives with remarkable works. And since I'm not an art historian, contrary to you, I not even an I was just an expert in art, and I could spend weeks upon weeks in documents which had nothing to do with Hollis, and the danger was to redo what was already existing, that is reproducing an existing pattern and where she would end up as a footnote. So I had to resist that. Um, then the feminist that I was, I would say to myself, well, my God, Mitchell and Joan as well. So I fell in love with these characters. They are larger than nature.
At the same time, you were talking about Joan, and you said that she was a feminist, but she didn't actually speak about it. Of course, at the time that she lived, she was part of the famous boys' club, the abstract artist. So she spoke like a man, she drank like a man, she painted like a man. So you must have found that interesting as well. Yes, it was very interesting. Whereas Mitchell would never have said that she was a feminist. She wouldn't say that she was part of that group. But even today, it's not as clear or as easy for some artists to say that they're a feminist. But for Joan Mitchell, she was part of a group of what Hélène de Billy characterized as cowboys. But when we spoke to them about women artists, well, we had to know that actually she swore. And also, that's how she actually manifested herself. But clearly, she was a feminist. Yes, because Hélène de Koenig and Lee Krasner are two extraordinary artists, but they were not able to become artists. Namely, we're speaking about the era when Pollock died, and Joan didn't want to be like that, even though she lived with Riopelle for 24 years. It was clear that there were two powers, two strengths of nature. Yes, but actually there's something very touching with Joan, and that's where we're sort of drawn in because she's complicated and what she regretted, and I've read this 1,000 times because people repeat the same anecdotes, and I'm always trying to look for the things that I didn't know. But, you know, she refused to marry Riopelle, and at one point, Riopelle was with a friend, and the friend said, well, why don't you marry her? And he actually stopped the car and asked the person to leave. But Joan said, you know what? All I want is a child, and I want a partner tried to help me to take care of the child, but she had abortions, etc. But she was a complicated person. And that's also interesting in the meeting that she had with Hollis. So it's Hélène de Kooning that introduced them. So Hélène said, come on, I'll introduce you. Of course you're going to get along. And then, of course, it went from friendship to love, and all of that was mixed up. But there were, I don't. Mitchell complained a lot about Riopelle, and she was being asked all the time, well, why do you stay with them? But Joan, Mitchell, and Hollis were very close. But at one point, Riopelle came back from a trip, came back to Quebec, and Hollis then understood why she didn't leave him, because he's incredibly charismatic. And one of the things that I say in the book that I talk about is that there's this life of these three people, and they all have a modus vivendi of how the two women can work together in their studio, and then they'll see Riopelle in the evening, etc. So they have a whole system in their daily lives that seems to work until such time as Riopelle fell in love with Hollis, and he told her, and Hollis clearly followed him. And when Hollis was asked the question, what happened? Well, people would say to Riopelle, why didn't you stay with Joan? But she was also, Hollis, a very complicated person. She was completely in love with Riopelle. So all of those stories say a lot about how women think about what's happening to themselves, what's of interest to them in their existence. Yes, actually, love relationships are never simple. In addition, the real love for artists is art. This is Sylvie Lacerte. What's interesting in the book as well is that you speak to her directly in French using the tu. You even say that you are false twins. This is Martine Delvaux. So what I was interested in is that part of the investigation, and I want to say that there are a whole bunch of people in my book. There are a lot of artists, journalists, etc., that I will include in the story, and I'm also fascinated by journalists. And I really like the way that I'm able to use the tu in French. From a writing perspective, it creates a certain closeness. And it's a bit like we were addressing the person more directly. But the tu is about the other person, but it's also about me. So in the end, maybe what I'm interested in is that through her, I don't think that I'm able to actually figure out who she is throughout all of the chapters, but she has a love of art, and that really speaks to me intimately. And I think that that's what's of interest to me. What is she saying? What is she saying to me about my love to writing, to literature? So what are we ready to do to produce art? That's the main question. And what's interesting as well, in what Sylvie has spoken about, there are a lot of works that we don't see usually, and that's the work that you've done, which is absolutely incredible. But also we can see the different materials, the diversity materials that can be used, and that's what Hollis saw with Riopelle. She saw the relationship between those artists, the love that they had for their practice. And
Riopelle se
given that
réinventait
Riopelle
suivant
would
l'état de son corps, quand
reinvent
il avait
himself,
mal
for
ou qu'il
example,
changeait de,
he had
il changeait de matériaux parce qu'il
médium.
pouvait plus
his
de médium
body
parce qu'il était
hurt
peintre
and he had
debout.
to
Alors,
change
il y a toutes
positions
sortes de...
because he wasn't
Hollis
able
a
to
fait la
paint
même chose.
standing
Alors,
up.
à la fin de sa
And Hollis
vie,
did the same thing
elle,
because at the end of
elle
her
a eu un
life,
cancer, elle a eu des
she
problèmes
had
cardiaques parce qu'elle
she
souffrait du
had
syndrome de Marfan.
cancer, she
Elle a
had
fini par
heart problems,
travailler
and
avec des
she ended up
crayons de
working
cire, avec
with
des crayons de
different types
bois,
of
des feuilles de gouache
crayons,
dans des
with
carnets, alors qu'elle
wood as
travaillait
well,
un peu
but
comme
crayons
Pollock.
in
Elle
books
travaillait
and
de la
notebooks.
toile à
Plat.
plat.
But
Par-dessus,
she
elle avait des
also
problèmes de
had
dos assez graves,
fairly
des douleurs
serious
chroniques.
chronic
Et
back
donc, au fil du temps,
problems,
elle s'est aussi
but
adaptée.
she
Son
was
corps
able to
bon, posait des
adapt
limites
her
et elle a
body.
travaillé en fonction de ça. Elle
But
a aussi
she
accepté de vivre
also
dans une certaine
accepted to
pauvreté.
live
Puis, il y a un
in,
moment où, quand
in
elle
a certain
quitte,
level of poverty.
elle
So
quitte
at one point,
Mitchell
she
pour aller
leaves
avec Riopelle,
Mitchell
mais il y a un
to
moment où
live
elle
with
quitte
Riopelle, but at
Riopelle
one
et
point she
Riopelle
left
se désire
Riopelle,
quand
and in
même
doing so,
quitter un mode de
she's also
vie
leaving a
Confortable.
luxueux. Ouais, elle ne va
lifestyle.
plus au château de Rothschild,
So there would no
dans ce
longer
week-end.
be any
Elle est
weekend
plus dans ce devenir
visits to the
aristocratique, si on
Chateau
veut, et elle se
Rothschild.
retrouve dans un
So
petit
ends
village de
up in a
pêcheurs
small
dans le sud de la Floride, à
fisherman a
Matlaché.
village in
À
southern
l'époque, il n'y a
Florida,
personne.
and
Bon,
at the
aujourd'hui,
time nobody lived there.
c'était une attrape touristique là, jusqu'à ce que l'ouragan vienne tout dévaster. Mais
So she lived
elle vit
there.
là, sans
She
peu de
didn't have a lot of
moyens. Et là, tout
means,
d'un coup, elle se met à
resources,
graver du
and at one point she started
plexiglas.
working with
Donc, il y a
plexiglass.
quelque chose de ça.
So there's something of
Et on
that
le
as
voit
well,
dans
and
la
we can
pratique de
see it
Riopelle,
in
on le voit
Riopelle's
chez
practice.
elle, moins chez Mitchell, qui est plus
Oui, oui.
toujours
Whereas
sur le
Mitchell was
même...
always on the same,
Même
on the
mode.
same.
Ouais.
Oui, c'est ça. Puis on a un peu l'impression aussi que
We also have the impression that
on apprend à te
we equally
connaître toi
learn to
aussi,
know
hein.
you better through
C'est
this
peut-être pas
work.
ta
It's maybe
biographie,
not your
mais il y a
autobiography,
quelque chose de
but
Ouais.
there's
ça dans
something about it.
le.
There's something,
Ouais.
a bit of it.
Étonnamment,
Well, yes,
on m'a dit,
surprisingly,
des lecteurs m'ont
some
dit que
readers
c'était mon livre le
told
plus
me that this
intime,
was my
alors que je
most
raconte rien,
intimate
en fait, de
work,
moi.
whereas
C'est
I
le seul
don't say
livre où je
anything about
parle pas
myself.
de
It's
manière
probably the only
anecdotique, c'est-à-dire où
work
ma
in
vie,
which I
les
don't
anecdotes
share
de ma vie ou les
anecdotes or
événements de ma vie
events
ne sont pas un point de
in
départ
my
pour mes
life,
pensées
and these events
universelles.
are
C'est
not
ça,
the
j'y tiens
starting point
vraiment.
for
Mais dans ce livre-là, il n'est pas
the
question de
inspiration for
moi,
the
de ce que je fais,
book. And I
sinon
said,
je
well,
fais
it's not
l'enquête,
about me.
mais,
Oui, oui.
Otherwise, I
mais ce qui
wouldn't
se
be
passe dans ma vie par
investigating. But
ailleurs, on ne le
what
sait pas.
happens elsewhere in my life, no
Mais
one
c'est
knows.
très rare que
So,
j'ouvre sur cet
and
amour-là de la littérature,
it is
cet
through
amour-là de
this work that I
l'écriture,
found
plutôt
that
même
love
ma
and
passion
passion for writing,
pour le cinéma, le
for
scénario, et
movies,
puis
for films,
ce
and everything
que
that
je
I
mets dans le
put in
livre, c'est que
that
j'aurais
work
toujours
is
voulu être
that I would
artiste. En fait,
always have wanted to be an artist.
je
I regret
regrette vraiment de ne
not
pas
knowing
savoir
how to
dessiner.
draw, for instance,
C'est
or
comme
paint.
artiste
It's
par
like
procuration.
Ah
being
oui, oui.
Oui, ça vient
it's like being an
c'est
artist
plus
by
intime dans les
proxy
livres. C'est
in a
tout
way. So
cet amour-là
this was a way
profond
of
d'une pratique
experiencing that
artistique.
love through
Mais
the
en tout
life of
cas,
another
je trouve que
artist.
quand tu
Well, I
parles de
think when you
l'art, tu
talk
en
about
parles vraiment très, très
art,
bien. Puis
you
quand tu parles
speak
des
about it
œuvres
really
des uns et des autres,
authoritatively, really
c'est
in a
vraiment
beautiful
très
way, and it's
intéressant.
very
Moi, en tout cas,
engaging. As far as I'm concerned, so
j'ai pas
I
eu le
have not had
sentiment
the
que tu
feeling
étais
that you were
débutante.
a
Mais je
novice
me
in the
suis fait,
field.
c'est drôle parce que
Well,
j'ai eu très
I
peur de ça,
used to
puis
be very scared about
j'ai
this,
des amis
and I have
artistes qui l'ont lu, qui m'ont
friends
rassurée.
from the art
Je
world
voulais
who
pas
read the book and who reassured me. I
je voulais
didn't want
vraiment pas
to
rater mon
really
coup,
miss my
mais je
target,
voulais pas non
but I
plus faire un
didn't want
cours,
to.
comment je peux dire,
I
donc
mean,
je
I
voulais pas
didn't want to
analyser les
analyze
œuvres comme
works the
on
same
ferait
way
profession
everyone
ou
else
moi je
does.
suis
I'm not
incapable.
capable of doing that at all.
Il y a une part
But there's a
d'histoire de
part
l'art, mais
of
par
it
la
which is a
bande.
Oui,
history
oui.
of art,
D'ailleurs,
and
le livre,
the work
il a
is
c'est un peu
in the
tantôt,
shop.
mais
I
c'est
saw it and
l'histoire de l'art sans les œuvres.
earlier.
Oui.
Ouais.
It's
Donc,
like a story
je
of
l'ai
art
acheté.
without
Bon,
men.
quand on connaît un peu
And when
l'histoire de
you know
l'art,
the
on
story of
n'apprend pas
art, I mean,
grand-chose. On
you
les
don't
connaît, ces
learn much.
femmes-là, mais
We
c'est
know those
intéressant
women, and
d'avoir
it's
un
interesting
portrait
to
de
have a
l'histoire de
portrait
l'art
of
ou du monde de
the
l'art.
artistic
Puis là,
world,
tout d'un
and
coup,
then
on
you
enlève
take the
les
men out
hommes.
of it,
Et là,
and then you
on
have
a
a
un autre
different landscape.
paysage.
Oui.
So
Donc, c'est un
that's
peu
what I
ça
try
que
to
je
do.
fais. C'est-à-dire que
And
je m'en...
obviously,
Évidemment,
yeah, I
je me
was
suis intéressée
interested
à tous
in
ces
all
grands
these
Pollock, Giacometti,
great
Beckett.
artists,
J'ai
Giacometti,
été
Beckett, and I was
complètement
completely
subjuguée par eux,
subjugated by
mais
their
j'essaie
influence. But
d'aller
I'm
chercher
trying
les
to go
femmes dont on
fetch
parle
those
pas,
women
Oui, oui,
who
c'est ça.
are on the
comme
wayside,
Hemingway
like
qui a été en couple
Hemingway, who
avec
was
Martha
in a
Gellhorn,
relationship
puis
with Martha
Martha Gellhorn
Gellhorn,
qui
who
se faisait
was interviewed.
interviewer, on lui posait des
She
questions
was
sur Hemingway,
questioned
puis elle
on
disait,
Hemingway,
je
and she was like,
serai la note en
I
bas de
will
page
not
dans la
be
vie
the
de
footnote
personne.
in the life of
Et ça,
anybody.
c'est ça
And
le
that's
récit du
that's the leitmotif of the book, critical opinion of art and going to talk about the things that people generally ignore. So yeah, so Alice was the footnote and Joan was not the footnote, but later on in life, actually. So, that's the interesting part of it. At the time when Riopelle was a celebrity in the art world in France, because she didn't exist. But today things have changed. So Mitchell, she's a mega star. But you must realize that this happened later in her life and career, and she was
Et
very
sa
bitter
mère
about
trouve
all
ça
this as
aussi
well.
très amer.
Yes, she paid the price. She really suffered as a
Puis un
result
truc
of
aussi
this.
qu'on ne dit
Another
pas
thing
de
that
Mitchell,
people
puis
don't
moi,
say about
j'aime à
Mitchell
rappeler,
that I
c'est
want to
elle a
highlight
écrit
is that
comme,
she's described the
comme
same
tu le
way
fais,
we
et comme on
do,
sait qu'elle
the way we
était.
knew her.
Elle
She
était
was
toute
a
seule, elle pouvait être
lonely person.
violente,
She could be
elle pouvait être,
violent.
on
It
dit
is even
qu'elle psychanalysait
said
de
that
manière
she used
sauvage
to
ses invités, elle les faisait souffrir, elle avait un peu
conduct a
quelque chose d'un
psychoanalysis of her
bourreau,
guests
mais
in a
elle
very vicious
était une
manner, but she
fervente
was a fervent
défenseur de l'art des
defender of
femmes.
a
Mhm.
women's
Donc, elle mettait le pied
artwork.
à New
As
York,
soon as she would
elle
get
allait
to
dans
New
les
York, she would
ateliers
go to
voir l'art des
art
jeunes
workshops
artistes,
and
elle se faisait conseiller, elle les
guide and
accueillait chez
advise
elle. Donc,
young female
c'est
artists.
sûr qu'elle avait un
She
côté
had
un
a
peu
very
vampirique, où Hollis dit, bon, mais si
vampire
j'étais restée avec
tendencies a bit,
Joan, finalement,
and
j'aurais
she
pas eu
said,
de
well,
vie
if
parce
she had
qu'elle
not
m'aurait
been
complètement avalée.
with
Oui, il y a de ça,
Mario
mais
Pell,
elle les
she wouldn't have
accueillait
had
quand
any
même,
life.
puis
And she used to,
leur servait de
mentor
mentor,
them.
elle
She
leur
would
donnait un
provide them
lieu,
with
elle
the
leur donnait
space and
des
provide them with the
matériaux. Ça
materials.
coûte cher
It's
faire de la
costly to
peinture.
paint.
Donc, il y avait
So
tout
she
ça
had
chez
all of
elle, et
this
ça,
in
j'aime
her, and I
le
like to
rappeler.
remind
Et
people
c'était une femme
about this, that
Elle
she
était
was a
généreuse.
generous
oui,
woman,
puis elle
and
regardait les
she,
femmes.
Ah oui.
she women
Ah oui,
matter
c'est
to her,
intéressant
Comme
ça.
like
Louise
Louise
Bourgeois,
Bourgeois
quand
said.
Bourgeois dit, mais c'est
What
quoi le
is
féminisme de Louise
Louise
Bourgeois? Mais c'est qu'elle
Bourgeois
est
feminism?
soutenue
She
pour
said
ce que font
it
les
is a
femmes.
sustained
C'était
interest
ça,
in what
Joan.
Ben
women
oui,
do,
c'est
and that's
ça.
what
Puis,
she was all about.
euh, vers la
Towards the
fin,
end,
tu
you
poses la
raised the
question
question
aussi à
of
qui appartiennent les
whom
artistes.
do artists
Mais c'est une bonne
belong?
question. Mais tu vois, comme
Well, not as
conservatrice,
a
comme
curator,
commissaire,
but
tu
or
sais,
not as a
à qui ils appartiennent? Est-ce qu'ils appartiennent au
do they belong
musée? Est-ce
to
qu'ils appartiennent aux
museums
collectionneurs? On a parlé
or
quand même.
galleries?
Tu sais, ça vient de
And
quelle collection?
in all the
C'est
networking
des
that's involved, this
grandes
is a
questions,
major
moi, je trouve.
question.
Ben,
As far as
c'est
I'm
une
concerned,
question
it's quite a
philosophique, en
philosophical
fait,
question
parce que c'est
because
sûr que les musées
galleries uh,
contiennent les
contain
collections de
collections from
plusieurs
several
artistes, les
artists,
collectionneurs
private
privés,
collectors,
les collections
corporate collections,
corporatives,
etc.
etc. Mais je
But
pense que
I think
les artistes, au départ,
artists from
s'appartiennent à
the
eux-mêmes.
onset, they belong to themselves, right? And
Ouais,
Ça
it
pourrait
couldn't
pas
be
être
otherwise.
autrement,
Otherwise,
sinon
they
ils
wouldn't be
travailleraient
able to
pas.
work, right?
c'est sûr, mais tu sais,
Well,
je pense que quand je
I
regardais la
think
vie
when I
de
looked at
Hollis, c'est pour ça
Hollis's
aussi qu'on a mis,
life,
bon, ce
that is why
tableau-là
we
en
put
particulier. Moi,
up this
je
work in
raconte dans le livre
particular,
que
and
j'ai
I
été
describe
très
it in the work. I'm
fidèle à la
very faithful
période de
to this
Vitaïsa. Tous les
period
tableaux
and all the
abstraits
abstract
de Hollis
works
pendant ces années-là,
by
les
Hollis
années de Joan
during
et
the
les
years when she
années
was with
de Jean
Joan,
Paul, si on veut, donc de
from
74
'74 to
à la
the
fin des
end
années
of the
80.
'80s.
C'est la
It's the
période que je
period that I
préfère du travail
prefer
de Hollis.
from
Après,
Hollis' work,
c'est des
and
centaines et des
these are
centaines
hundreds and
d'œuvres. Hein.
hundreds
Vous
of
allez
work.
sur
I
le
went to
site Hollis Jeffcoat
her
Project,
website,
il y a
Hollis
quand
Jeffcoat
même, il y
Project,
en a
and
beaucoup qui
there
ont
were
été
many of them that were
catalogués
cataloged
de
in
manière par
uh,
Alberto
by
qui s'est
Alberto, who was
intéressé à ça.
interested in her works.
Elle a fait
She
énormément
did a
de choses,
lot
mais
of
plus on
stuff,
avance dans le
and
temps, plus,
more we
pour moi,
move
ça
in
devient
time,
plus
the more it
commercial.
becomes
Et elle a une
commercial. She
galerie
has a
avec
gallery
avec sa
with her
compagne
partner,
et
and
elle fait partie de certaines
she
collections et
splits
tout.
them
Et
in
tu sais, ça
different
pose la question du
collections.
pour
And
qui
this
on
raises the question
travaille.
of for whom do
Quand il
we
y a une
work,
mesure, on fait de
and to what
l'art,
extent are we still producing art?
il y a un
And
selected few
there's a
qui
select
arrivent à
few
vivre
in
de
the
Oui,
la
oui,
critique
world of
artistique. Fait que
art who
absolument.
are
Non,
able
mais
to
c'est
c'est
ça
ça.
qui est
live
compliqué.
Il faut
thanks to
payer l'épicerie
their
aussi,
works.
c'est
Oui,
sûr
Yes,
qu'il
of course, and
y a
you
beaucoup
have your
d'artistes qui se
groceries
posent cette
to do,
question-là
right?
et
And
de
you have to
commissaires
live
aussi.
et
off
le
your
commissaire
work.
et les
And
collectionneurs ont un rôle à jouer.
curators have a role
Oui,
Je
to
me suis
play,
intéressée aussi à des
as well as
collectionneuses
collectors, and
oui.
qui vont
they have
faire
to make an
l'effort
effort
de
to
collectionner des œuvres de
collect the
femmes parce qu'on
works
sait
of
très bien
women.
que la
And we know
valeur
that the
des œuvres de
value
femmes
of
est
women's works
éminemment
is
inférieure
eminently
Inférieur.
à celle des
inferior
hommes. Elles sont beaucoup
to
moins
those of
collectionnées, elles valent
women.
moins
They
d'argent.
have
Donc,
fewer collections
une
and they
vraie
have less
question
money. So this
économique et
is an
politique
economic and political
Oui,
issue
mais
that
artistique.
les choses
deserves
s'améliorent,
attention.
ça peut être
But I can
rassurant.
assure you that things
Non,
Ça
are
c'est ça.
improving.
s'améliore, mais,
But
oui,
yeah,
c'est
that's
effectivement
effectively the
la
reality
réalité que
that women's
les
works
femmes ont souvent une
often
valeur
have
moindre
a lower value than
à celle
that
des
of
hommes.
men.
Et puis, je
Also,
voudrais
I'd like
savoir
to
comment
know,
tu
how do you
émerges de cette
emerge
quête.
from this quest? Well,
Difficilement.
Ah oui.
it's been
Ben, je veux
tough.
dire, je pense,
I
on
mean, you
pense à
move
autre
on to
chose, là,
something else,
c'est sûr,
obviously, but
mais c'est peut-être
this
le
is
projet
probably the
qui m'a habité
project
le
that
plus
stayed with
longtemps,
me
qui m'a
for much
demandé le plus
longer,
de
which
travail.
required much more work and
C'est
investigation.
c'est pas
It is not
seulement
just
l'espèce de
the
postpartum, c'est que je vivais avec ces
postpartum
gens-là.
stress
Oui,
or
c'est ça.
what it
Ouais,
was the
et je
experience
les
that I
ai pas
had with
vus
these people,
encore
and I'm not
débarrassés, par
completely rid
exemple,
of
des
all about that. Of course, I've stacked away the articles, and I have a library close to my work table, but it's still stacked full with books and paper clips. And I mean, every morning I would wake up and to try and write a script, or to try and write a book, or uh, 10-hour script. And since I published the book, I also received messages from people who knew these characters, and uh, they're writing to me and saying, well, yeah, I met with Hollis. I met her under such and such circumstances, and there was a man with whom she was in love in Paris when she was living with Francis Bacon, and they were supposed to live together, settle together in the US, but this didn't happen, and I was in contact with him. So there are other things, trickling out of these post-publication process. So yes, it doesn't end with the publication of the book. So yeah, it gives me the feeling that maybe I should open up the book and include this other short part or discovery in the book. So it still feels like I'm still living with them. What about you? After Riopelle, what next?
Ben, après,
Well, I don't
je
know.
ne sais pas, parce
Truly
que c'est
speaking,
pas
because
encore tout à fait
it is
après.
we're still in
Ça
it.
va à
After this,
Winnipeg.
we'll
Et
head to
donc,
Winnipeg.
je vais
I'll
aller
go
à
to
Winnipeg
Winnipeg
pour la fin du
for
montage
the
de l'exposition,
end
mais
of
c'est quelque
the
chose qui
preparation of
m'a
this exhibition. This is
occupé
something that
pendant
has
un bon moment.
taken
Et
up
puis moi
quite
aussi,
a
j'ai
certain
encore
amount
des
of
livres dans ma
time
bibliothèque
on my schedule, and I
que
still
j'ai
have quite a
utilisés
number
pour
of
mes
books
recherches,
that I used
les
during the
articles,
research.
les ai
The
vendus.
articles are stacked
Mais
away,
bon,
but
ça a
it
été
was
très
quite
prenant. J'ai été vraiment
taxing, and I was
inspirée
completely absorbed in the process. As you
dans
mentioned,
tout un univers
I
que je
was,
connaissais très peu.
taken
Je
up
vous
in a
l'avoue
universe that I
humblement.
didn't know, and I
J'ai
got
appris
into it with a
énormément de
lot of
choses.
humility
Puis,
and learned
oui,
quite a
ça a
lot.
Ouais,
été
moi
Same
vraiment
here. Yeah, really
intéressant.
interesting.
Et je pense,
And I
je sais pas
don't
si les
know if,
gens, tu sais, une fois qu'il y a
they're
les icônes, il y a ce
icons.
qu'on
There are
en
things that we
sait,
know
ce qu'on
about
en dit,
them.
bon,
There are
les
things that
œuvres
we
qu'on
know about
connaît
their
un peu,
works,
mais
but
le
the
détail de
details
leur
of their
vie est
Oui,
lives
aussi
oui,
is
complètement
intéressant. Oui,
completely
impressionnant.
oui,
impressive.
absolument.
C'est,
And
Ils ont eu
yes,
des
they
vies
lived
hors normes, ces
out of the
gens-là.
ordinary lives,
Et
and
donc,
so
c'est
it is
vraiment
quite
fascinant
fascinating
de
to
voir à
see
travers,
this,
de voir
to
tous les
see
chemins
all
à
the
travers lesquels ils
different
sont passés,
ouais,
paths that
autant dans
they
leur vie
took,
personnelle que dans la
both
vie
in their
artistique.
personal
absolument.
and artistic lives.
Mais les
But
deux
the two
sont vraiment
meshed together. They are
indissociables.
Ouais.
La vie
inextricable. The
artistique et
artistic
personnelle est
and private
vraiment
life of these persons are
liée.
inextricably
Ah oui, non,
linked.
pour ces
Yes, of
personnes-là,
course, for these
c'est
people's
sûr et certain.
that's
Ouais.
for these
Ouais.
people, that's for sure.
Moi, j'ai beau
And I
aussi aimer
really
les,
loved
entendre plus le
the
côté
literary
littéraire, mais
aspect, and also the
comment
way he
il
spoke,
parlait,
the
comment
way
Riopelle
Riopelle
parlait,
spoke, the
comment
way
Oui,
Joan
Jones
s'exprimait,
expressed
comment Hollis
herself, the way
s'exprimait.
oui,
Il y a quelque chose
Hollis
aussi
expressed
moi, dans le
themselves, and there's
rapport au
equally
langage
something
oui,
in that book
qui
about
m'a beaucoup...
their
et
relationship
Riopelle
with
en
language,
particulier, d'ailleurs.
which
oui, dans
really
sa façon de parler.
like.
Ouais.
And well,
Ben,
thank you very
merci. Est-ce que
much.
tu as
Do you
d'autres
have
choses à
something else to add?
ajouter?
Well,
Ben,
no,
non,
I don't
moi,
know.
je pense que c'est... Je regarde
Looking
le
at the
moniteur. Non,
timer,
c'est
Mais
ça.
I think
On est rendu au...
on est
we're
rendu aux
now at the
questions. Est-ce
Q&A
que vous avez des
session. Do you
questions?
have any questions so far?
Mon
Oh
Dieu,
là
ce
là!
petit public
This
très gentil d'être
small
là.
and kind
Ben, il y a des
audience.
gens du
We have people
musée
from
aussi,
the
peut-être
museum
ils en savent
um,
déjà
Ouais,
assez.
yeah,
c'est ça.
who are here.
Mais
Well,
bon,
then,
alors
David,
David, est-ce qu'il y a des
have any
questions qui viennent
questions online or
de
virtually?
nos amis en ligne?
No
Ah,
Pas de
questions?
questions.
voilà.
Okay.
Bon, ben
Well, then,
écoutez, un grand merci.
yes,
Oui,
ma'am.
madame, si vous
Please,
pouvez aller au
could you
micro.
go to a mic?
Allô. Oui.
So
8
for how
ans.
long did she live with Riopelle?
Ouais.
For 8 years. Was it in the US?
Elle s'est
Well,
promenée
she
avec lui.
traveled
En
with
fait,
him. They
ils ont
lived
vécu en
together in
France
France
pendant
for
un
some
bout. Donc,
time.
ils sont installés
They
dans la
stayed
Frémico parce
at
qu'ils n'arrivaient
Fremico's
pas à trouver un
workshop because
endroit
they couldn't find a
où
place to
loger. Et
stay.
après, ben, ils se sont
Then after
improvisés.
that, they
Ils
traveled,
partaient
they moved a lot.
ben,
They
sur un coup
would
de
just
tête.
decide
Riopelle, c'était ça.
spontaneously.
Un jour, il disait,
Sometimes
bon, ben,
Riopelle would just say,
on s'en
well,
va au
let's go to
Québec.
Quebec. And they
Et
would,
il disait, on va
and they
revenir
would
dans
say
une
they would
semaine.
come
Il
back
restait 3
in a week's
mois.
time,
Et elle
but they would stay
suivait.
for like 3 months, and then they
Ils
would leave
partaient
together. They would go
au
to
Québec à l'Estérel,
Quebec
à
and
l'Île-aux-Grues,
Esterel and
souvent. Retourner dans le
Ilogru, and
sud de
would
la
go back to
France
the
avec le
south of
bateau,
France by
le
boat
voilier,
because there was a
le
ferry,
Sylvika,
and would
monter
go
à
back to
Paris.
Paris,
Ils
and
faisaient
that's
ça,
how they
ils
would
se promenaient.
travel.
Sans compter
I
d'autres
mean, that
voyages,
is this is
vraiment
besides other
ailleurs
travels
pour des questions
elsewhere
d'expo,
for
etc.
exhibitions,
Mais
etc.
elle
But
le
she
suivait.
used to travel with him. So
Elle se parlait
they spoke
anglais.
to one
Ouais, et
another
pendant...
in English.
Ouais, les deux étaient américaines.
Both ladies were
Avec
Americans.
au début,
At
Hollis
the
ne parlait
beginning,
pas français,
Hollis didn't
donc ils
speak
devaient se parler en anglais,
French,
mais elle a
but
fini
she
par
ended up
apprendre le
learning how to
français.
speak French.
Mais ce
And
qu'elle
from what
raconte,
she
c'est qu'au
recounts
début,
at the
quand elle a
beginning when
rencontré
she met with Joan,
ben, je le
I
dis
mean,
de
I would
même,
say
mais
it, but
c'est
it's
plus
more
subtil
subtle
que
than
ça, mais elle
this.
lui interdisait
I
d'apprendre le
mean,
français.
forbade her
C'est ça.
from
Puis
learning
Joan voulait la
French.
garder pour
Joan
elle,
wanted to
donc
keep her for herself, all to herself.
c'était un
And
peu la,
she was very possessive. She was a bit like a princess in a tower, and in a certain way, and she would keep her to herself, and she used to discourage her from going to Paris, and wanted to keep her with her, and didn't teach her how to speak French. And at some point, there's something happened. There was a car accident, a really serious car crash where Hollis was seriously injured, and it is at that point that things changed, and then she left with Riopelle. And at the time of the crash, she wasn't speaking French, and it happened an hour away from Paris, and she couldn't understand what people were saying, and she was completely monolingual. And it is later that she would learn French with Riopelle.
La langue.
Ouais.
Interpreter apologizes, but we can't hear
Moi, c'est
the
un peu un
person asking
mystère.
the
Moi, quand je
questions.
les ai
So
vus,
yes,
elle lui
she
parle
speaks
français, donc
to
elle a
him in
appris le
French, so
français
she
là, dans les
learned French
documentaires, dans les
through
films,
documentaries and movies.
mais c'est sûr
But
qu'au
from the
début, non.
outset, she didn't speak
Et lui
French.
parlait
He spoke
anglais,
to
puis c'est
her in
avec
English
Joan, je
because I
pense
think
qu'il
with Joan,
basculait. Joan, il
Joan,
d'une langue à
they would
l'autre tout le
switch
temps.
from one language to the other all the time.
Et puis
And
Hollis
Hollis
était
was
une
a
bonne
good hunter,
chasseuse
right?
aussi.
Was a
Ben,
great
c'est ça.
hunter.
Je pense que Hollis, ce qu'on en dit,
Hollis,
c'est ça
that's
qui
another
est
thing that's
étonnant, c'est
surprising,
la
that
connaisse pas, alors
we
que
don't know that
quand on
much
lit,
about her, but when you read and you
cherche, comme je
research the
l'ai
way I
fait,
did,
on se rend
you
compte que
realize
pour
that for
Riopelle, c'était
Riopelle,
vraiment un
it was
grand
a
amour.
great love.
Cette femme-là,
He
il
really
l'aimait
loved this
vraiment.
woman.
Il a
He
tout
did
fait pour
everything
la
possible to keep
garder.
her with him,
C'est elle
and she's the one
qui a
who kept
résisté puis qui a dit non, je
resisting.
peux plus parce qu'elle était en
Said
train de devenir son
no, she
infirmière.
couldn't
Elle
because
se rendait compte
she
que
was
si elle
becoming a
restait, ben, il y avait
nurse,
un
and
grand
there was
écart d'âge,
a
hein,
great
faut quand même
age
le noter.
gap between them, and
Elle
she
allait
was
plus
not
pouvoir
going to be able
peindre
to
parce que
keep
là, lui allait
painting,
prendre toute la
taking
place.
care of
Donc, c'est
him was
quand
going
même,
to occupy quite some space in her life.
elle
So she
incarnait tout ce que
was an
Riopelle
incarnation
pouvait
of everything
vouloir,
that
si on veut,
Riopelle could ever
pour dire de
want
même, d'une
from a
compagne.
partner.
Elle pouvait
She could
chasser, elle pouvait
hunt, she could
pêcher,
fish.
elle n'était pas
She wasn't
pensante,
the
elle se
harassing type.
moulait à son
She
mode
could
de
blend
vie,
into his
elle pouvait
lifestyle. She would
accoucher, elle
cook, she
s'occupait
would
de
take care
lui.
of him. Yeah,
Ben
I mean,
voilà, je veux dire, elle
um,
était aussi tout
so
ça.
Oui, oui,
Ouais.
c'est ça.
Fait qu'elle
so she,
était,
when
quand on
you
les
see
voit dans
them
ce
in this
film
beautiful
magnifique
movie,
de l'auteur
um,
fabuleux, cette scène
this scene that I
que j'essaie
try
de
to
raconter dans mon
recount in
livre,
my
on le voit
movie, you
l'amour
can
entre
see
Oui,
eux.
that
oui,
love
Puis on voit la
vraiment.
joie
Oui,
transpiring
qu'il y a
between
entre eux,
them,
la
the joy,
complicité.
tout à
the
fait.
Et elle a
that
du chien, là.
Oui, oui.
Elle
companionship,
a, au
that
début, vingtaine,
uh,
puis elle lui dit, mais vous
she
êtes
said,
Riopelle,
well,
c'est quoi faire du
do
Riopelle?
some
Vous êtes
Riopelle, and what
Riopelle.
was it?
Puis là,
What
c'est
is
quand
Riopelle all
même, je
about?
regardais, je disais,
And
mais
I said,
voyons
well, my
donc,
God, you
il
talking
parle même
this
à
way to
Riopelle, c'est
Riopelle,
quand même...
it's
Fait qu'il,
and so
et Joan,
Joan, it was the
pareil,
same thing when
quand
he
elle
meets with
rencontre Joan
Joan
la
for the
première
first time.
fois,
Joan says,
Joan lui
what
demande,
do
mais
you
t'en
think
passes pas
about
de mon
my
tableau? Puis elle dit,
um,
ben, je trouve que tu vas pas
my
assez
painting?
loin.
She said, well, you're not
Voyons, c'est
going
bien
that
méchant,
far. And
là.
Oui.
C'est
I mean,
pas...
this is a celebrity.
quand
This,
Mais
même.
but
Joan a
Joan
aimé ça.
Et
loved
Joan
that
a aimé ça,
criticism
donc
of
c'est
our
des
work.
artistes
And
qui
these
avaient
were artists
besoin
who
aussi
needed to
d'avoir
have
quelqu'un qui
someone
avait
who
du
was
front,
bold,
qui était
who could
un vrai
be a
vis-à-vis,
real
Qui disait la vérité
critic,
aussi.
and
C'est
pas
ça.
someone
de
who would
complaisance.
speak
Et
the
ça,
truth
c'était
and not be
important.
complacent,
C'est ça.
Qui est
even if this would lead to
particulier.
disputes
Mais
later
Oui,
on.
oui,
mais
c'est
ouais.
ça. Ah, Luc, tu as une question?
Merci à vous. Ouais. Ouais, de Mitchell aussi, ouais. Ouais. Non, 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 non. Mais la seule, en fait, j'accorde un rôle
So
particulier à Hélène de
I
Billy.
allow
C'est
Hélène de
comme,
Billy to have a
c'est
very
comme si
specific
je la
role.
tirais du lot puis je dis, OK, elle, c'est comme un
She's a
personnage
bit
de
like
mon
a
livre.
character
Hélène,
in
on
my
s'est
book. And I
rencontrés, je
met
l'ai
Hélène.
interviewée.
I
C'est une
interviewed
très longue
her. It was a
entrevue
very long interview
parce que je voulais juste leur
because
parler de
I
son
wanted
travail.
her
J'étais
to
fascinée par
speak
son
to
travail.
me
Puis il ne faut pas
about her
oublier
work.
que, ben, comme Patricia Albert,
But
mais surtout Hélène de
Hélène
Billy, elle
de
a fait une
Billy
biographie à une époque où il
did
n'y a
a
pas de, il y a
biography
pas de
on
Google, il n'y a pas
Riopelle,
de web, il n'y a pas de...
Riopelle
C'est des
rather, and
fax
there was
revenir.
no
Donc, elle a bâti ses
internet.
archives
There were
à la
facts, there
Bibliothèque
were archives
nationale
that
à
she had to
Ottawa.
go through.
Donc, j'ai pu
So
tout
you know what?
feuilleter,
I
j'ai
was
vu
able to
toutes les
look at
copies, les
all of the
messages, les
messages, all
cartes.
the cards that
C'est
she
comme
received.
hallucinant de
And
faire une
it was
biographie. Ça
really
fait 10 ans
fascinating
quand
to
même
see
comme
how
biographie
somebody
de
writes a
Riopelle. C'est très,
biography. It
très
took
long,
her
très,
10
très
years to write
compliqué.
his.
Donc, je voulais lui
So
rendre
I wanted to
hommage,
pay
en fait, à
tribute to
Hélène
Hélène in my
dans mon
book.
livre à moi. Patricia
Patricia
Albert, je
Albert,
lui ai
I
écrit, elle m'a
wrote to
donné le
her,
verbatim
and she
des
gave me the
entrevues qu'elle a faites
verbatim of
avec
the
Hollis,
interviews
mais
that she had with
au-delà de
Hollis.
ça, c'était
But
plus
beyond
Riopelle
that,
parce que
I
c'était le
was really
rapport à Riopelle
interested in
qui était comme le point de
Riopelle
départ, si on veut,
because
de
the
mon enquête.
relationship with Riopelle was
J'ai
really
fait que
the
je voulais
starting
essayer de
point
faire,
for my
il y avait du réel aussi
investigation.
là-dedans,
But there was also the mentor for Hélène de Billy, who was responsible for the biography of a number of significant people, including Simone de Beauvoir. I wanted to pay tribute to those women. It's a bit like the work that Sylvie is doing. For example, I could put Sylvie in my book. I could talk about the women who work in the background. For example, the Simone de Beauvoir's biographer must have worked really hard to be able to have access to her, because at some point the biographer must ask themselves, what should I do with this information? Should I add it or not? But you know, in fact, in this particular case and in other cases, I'm really talking about women who work in the background. This is Sylvie Lacerte. Actually, Hélène de Billy on Simone de Beauvoir was an unauthorized biography. Actually, it was an unauthorized biography of Riopelle, but she did interview him. The interpreter cannot hear the question that's being asked.
Oui.
For me, says Sylvie Lacerte, it was important to have artists who were close to Riopelle, who were artists at the same time. But of course, we were doing a retrospective on Riopelle, so we had to make decisions, we had to make choices. So in making choices, of course, certain things had to be set aside. So I chose San Francis because he was very close to Riopelle in the 1950s. And of course, I absolutely wanted to have a work by Joan Mitchell. This is a work that was produced in 1992, right before her death. And that was also the year that Riopelle had worked on Rosa Luxembourg. But there was also Françoise, another artist, and she really liked Riopelle as a painter, as a person. She prepared triptychs, and Joan prepared triptychs as well. So there was a certain correspondence in the work. And for the artists that lived at that same time, what I wanted to do was to be able to show the legacy that Riopelle left to the generations that came after him. I wanted there to be a real coherence and a real presentation, for example, with Marc-Antoine Faneuf with the hockey cards. And he was sort of imitating Riopelle's mosaic, or there's also Brian Hogan's work. There was, and through Riopelle's work, Les Rois de Tulé, well, there were certain people that Riopelle was really fascinated, that really fascinated him, rather. And he learned about this legend when he was in Paris. But there was also a serendipitous encounter between the artists, whether or not they were from very different cultures or generations. So it was important for me to create those types of relationships with Mr. Riopelle.
Merci à vous tous et toutes. Merci d'avoir été si attentifs et attentifs.
Un public très sage.
Oui. Merci.